This presentation has been put together to explain in a little bit more detail the checks which are required as part of your school's single central record. The single central record should capture all checks completed on employed staff and volunteers, and this presentation will help you to understand a little bit more about what those different checks are. And it should also contain confirmation that external organisations have completed the necessary checks on their employees. There's further information about the single central record included within the statutory guidance Keeping Children Safe in Education, September 2018. And this document is where you'll find further detail and where it confirms that your single central record is a record of checks being carried out, certificates obtained, and it also needs to include the date on which each check was completed or the certificate obtained. The guidance also states that schools and colleges may also wish to record the name of the person who carried out each check, and this is really useful, particularly if the checks are going back historically and various staff have been overseeing the single central record. It's really useful to be able to see who was actually responsible for completing the checks at the time, so that is worth considering. So the record itself covers three distinct categories of adults who may be working with pupils or students in your school or college. And for the purpose of this presentation, I've broken that down into employed staff, which we'll look at in a moment. The second category then focuses on staff who are not directly employed by yourself as the school or college, but by an external organisation or third party. And then the third category that we'll look at are volunteers, and that's the category that includes governors and trustees. So the requirements for each of these different categories is slightly different in terms of what needs to be completed in terms of the check and also what needs to be recorded on your single central record. It's worth saying at this point that the statutory guidance doesn't include an agreed template. So whilst there is information and detail about what needs to be on the record, there isn't anywhere a single template for the single central record, which sometimes is a little bit frustrating because schools interpret the guidance in different ways. So your single central record may look slightly different, your column headings may look slightly different to what I'm going to show you on here. They may be in a different order, but essentially if you're not sure, it's always worth referring back to the statutory guidance Keeping Children Safe, page 40, just to clarify if you're not sure. Okay, so let's start by looking at the section on employed staff. So if we think about who these individuals who these individuals are that are possibly going to be included on this section, we're thinking here about all staff who are directly employed by your school or college, so teachers, support staff, teaching assistants, site staff, cleaners if the school directly employs them, office administrative staff, catering again, catering staff, but only if employed directly by the school or college. And this is probably the section from the three that has the most detail, the greatest number of checks, and has the most number of columns included. Again, most schools tend to use an Excel spreadsheet to record their single central record because of ease of use. And that's what you'll see an example of as I'm talking through this. Okay, so the first columns on the section for employed staff are including the name of the member of staff, address, their date of birth, and then you'll see in column 4 reference to photo ID. So your single central record has to include a column where you're confirming that photo ID has been checked, the date on which this was checked, and ideally who has checked this photo ID. There's further information about what can be used as photo ID on the gov.uk website if you're not sure, but essentially it tends to be either a passport or a photo driving licence card, which is used for this purpose. There's also a column moving on which looks at the date the member of staff started with the school and their job title. So fairly straightforward. And those are the first few columns on your first section for employed staff. If we move on then to the next section for employed staff, this is looking at qualifications. Again, fairly straightforward, 2 columns. One which is identifying whether a professional qualification is required for the role that the member of staff is completing. And if the answer is yes, then listing the actual qualification that's in place. And then the second column, as you can see from the slide, is the date, again, that the qualification was checked and by who. So again, fairly straightforward. Then we move on to the third section, a little bit more information here, and this can cause some confusion, so I'm hoping that this will make that a little clearer for people if they're not quite sure. So this section is looking at the checks that are completed via the Disclosure and Barring Service. So used to be called CRB checks, so Criminal Records Bureau checks, now known as Disclosure and Barring checks, and these have been in place since 2002. So anybody who you employ who has been in post prior to 2002, they may not have a CRB or DBS check in place. They will have had a List 99 check. Now, unless they've had a break in service of more than 3 months, they can still continue to work in school with that List 99 check in place. There's no requirement for them to have a DBS check as long as they've not had a break in service of more than 3 months. So you'll see reference to that in the 5th column along on the slide, just for schools where you've got long-standing members of staff. So in terms of the DBS checks, these are completed by schools and colleges. There are different levels of check, which we'll look at in a moment, which you'll see reference in the first column. It says enhanced DBS check, so schools and colleges will complete checks at least at an enhanced level, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. DBS disclosure number, so you have to include reference to the disclosure number from the certificate of the DBS, and again we'll look at where you'll find that information in a moment on the certificate. And the third column references barred list checks. So these are checks for individuals who are working in regulated activity. Again, we'll come on to that in a moment. So let's have a look at the different levels of DBS. So there are 3 types of DBS checks which are available, but on the whole, schools and colleges will be looking at the enhanced check or the enhanced with a barred list check. We don't tend to complete standard DBS checks in schools and colleges. And you can see from the slide what information is included in these checks. So standard and enhanced, fairly similar. So it's information from the Police National Computer about convictions, cautions, reprimands and warnings which are held on the computer, regardless or not of whether they are spent under the Rehabilitation Act 1974. The enhanced check is the same as the standard, but there's also any approved information held by the police which they deem to be relevant and believe should be disclosed because of their work with children. The third level of check, which is the highest level of check, is known as an enhanced check with a barred list check. So this is in essence 2 separate checks. So there's an enhanced check, as we've just talked about, and then a barred list check is a check of the barred list for adults whose crimes have been listed on the barred list check as meaning that they are unsuitable to work with children. There's also a barred list for adults, which we will look at in a moment. So let's just have a look at a DBS certificate. So this is what the individual will receive back once the check has been completed by the school or college. So the certificate will come back directly to the individual who the check has been completed on, and they must present this certificate, the original copy of the certificate, in the school when they receive this. They must bring it into school and show the original copy. Now you'll see from the top right hand corner there's reference to certificate number. So that's the number that you're recording on the single central record, and you'll see the date of issues there as well, and that's the date that you need to record on your single central record for the date that the certificate was produced. If you look further down, you'll see some boxes, and in the third box down, reference to the children's barred list information. So this is really useful to be aware of this, because sometimes you may not be sure, particularly if a check has been completed a while ago, whether a barred list check was requested as well as an enhanced DBS. If in that box it says non-requested, then that means that the barred list check has not been checked, just an enhanced DBS check. So just the check of the Police National Computer and not a check of the barred list, the children's barred list. If it says non-recorded, as it says here, that means that a check has been completed against the barred list as well as an enhanced DBS, and there's nothing referenced on there to do with this individual. They're not listed on the barred list. You'll also see there's reference underneath to the adults barred list, and that's a separate barred list for that was checked for adults working with vulnerable adults. So there's further information just to remind us about the fact that there are these two separate lists. And then we're going to look at who needs to have these checks. So this is where there's sometimes a little bit of confusion about who needs which check. So if an individual is working in your school with children in regulated activity, then they must have an enhanced DBS and a check against the barred list. So what do we mean by regulated activity? So this is the definition of regulated activity. So in essence, what this is saying is that if you're working unsupervised with children in the capacity of teaching, training, instructing, caring for or supervising, then you will need to have this barred list check completed, particularly because schools and colleges are listed as within this range of establishments. It doesn't include work done by supervised volunteers. So as long as volunteers are being supervised, they don't need to have the barred list check done. They just need to have an enhanced DBS done. You'll also see on the columns on the presentation reference to the update service. So the update service is an additional service that an individual, the individual who's having the check done on them, can opt into, and this makes their DBS certificate really up to date and allows employers to do a really up to date check of DBS information. So within 30 days of having an enhanced DBS check completed, the individual can apply to be on the update service. And what this means is that you're given an additional PIN number, which your employee can input into the DBS website, and this will inform them whether since the date of the DBS certificate being issued, whether there have been any further reprimands, cautions, convictions on the Police National Computer. So it makes the certificate much more up to date and useful. The not everybody's aware that they can do this, so some people haven't signed up to this service because they're not overly clear about what it does, but it is a really useful thing to have. There's a £13 annual charge for this service, but particularly useful for people who are moving around and have a more of a make sure DBS more portable. In addition to the DBS checks, the enhanced DBS checks and barred list checks, if an individual has lived or worked outside of the UK, they must also apply for something called an overseas check, which is essentially where they are contacting the consulate of the country that they've lived or worked in, and they're asking for a certificate of good conduct. If a conviction was committed abroad, that wouldn't show on a UK DBS disclosure. So this is a process that's in place to ensure that anybody who's had time abroad, if they have committed an offence, that there's an opportunity for that information to be disclosed via the Certificate of Good Conduct. And there's further information in Keeping Children Safe, along with all the details of and addresses of who to contact, depending on the country that the individual has lived or worked in. The next section of the this category, moving on then from the DBS checks and barred list checks, is a check to ensure that the individual has a right to work in the UK. And again, sometimes people get this confused with overseas checks. So this is separate. This is not to do with overseas checks. This is checking that individuals, if they don't have a passport, a British passport, that they have a right to work in the UK via either a visa or a work permit. So this is where that information is recorded together with the date of the visa or work permit expiring, if that's required, and when that was checked. And then the next section is for a specific group of employed staff. So these are prohibition checks. These are checks, additional checks, separate to DBS and barred list information, separate to overseas checks. These are checks to do with suitability for the role and are completed on individuals who have a teaching role in the main, with the exception of section 128, which we'll look at in a moment. But the other checks here are all completed on anybody who has a teaching role, and they're checked via the DfE Secure Access website, which you will require a password to get into. So there's a range of different checks included here, as you can see from the column headings. So we've got QTS check, we've got whether they failed their induction or probation, whether they've been subject to a suspension or conditional offer, and that information is all held on the DfE Secure Access website. You'll also see in the second column here, teacher not prohibited from the profession. So if we have a little look at that in a little bit more detail. So basically a teacher prohibition order is made by the Secretary of State following consideration by a professional conduct panel, and it prevents a person from working in a teaching capacity in schools, sixth form colleges, 16 to 19 academies and children's homes. So this check came into force in April 2012. You're not required to do retrospective checks. So it's anybody who's been employed in a teaching role since April 2012 needs to have to be checked against this particular check. The other check that you'll see referenced on the DfE site is an EEA check, and you'll see this referenced in Keeping Children Safe as a required check that needs to be completed. Again, this is for anybody who has a teaching role and who has spent time abroad. So this is in addition to the overseas checks. This is another check, separate check, and this is where any information about a sanction or restriction that's been placed on a teacher while they've been working abroad is provided as part of this check, so that it can be considered when that individual is being appointed. This check is fairly recent, so it came into force on the 18th of January 2016. So again, anybody employed prior to that date, you don't need to go back and check. It's just people in post since that date. And there's further information on EEA checks in Keeping Children Safe. And then the last check of this section are the section 128 checks. Now, these are a little bit confusing because they're different requirements for academies and maintained schools. So if you are an academy or free school, then section 128 checks need to be completed for the bullet pointed list here on the slide. So anybody who has a senior management or leadership position, including positions which carry department headship, and also governors and trustees. So section 128 is a check to do with financial mismanagement. So it's checking that anybody who has been prohibited under this particular section is prevented from taking part in the management, particularly the financial management of academies and free schools. And this check came into place on the 5th of September 2016 for academies and free schools. Now, interestingly, in September 18, when the revised version of Keeping Children Safe came into place, they also extended this requirement for governors of maintained schools. So as of September 18, if you've appointed new governors and you're a maintained school, you'll also need to complete a Section 128 check. So these can be done via the DFE website that we've talked about, the Secure Access website. There's further information in Keeping Children Safe about these checks. Okay, so that's the section of checks for staff who are employed directly by the school. So if we move on then to look at individuals who are externally employed by an external organisation or a third party or an agency. So the types of roles that we're talking about here include supply teachers, peripatetic music teachers, contractors, sports coaches, and what the statutory guidance says on in paragraph 152 is that schools and colleges must obtain written notification from any agency or third-party organisation they use that the organisation has carried out checks. So what it's saying is you don't have to keep written confirmation of the individual checks on your single central record for these staff. You just need to confirm that you've had written notification from the organisation which states that they have completed all of the relevant and required checks. In addition, in September 2018, that requirement also extended to include alternative providers. So if you use any alternative provision where your pupils or students are going off site to receive their education for part of the week, then you also will need to have written confirmation from those alternative providers that they've completed the appropriate checks. And we sometimes refer to these as letters of assurance. So this is the written confirmation that we're talking about. Now, interestingly, on my visits to schools, I see varying quality in these letters of assurance from external agencies. So I've put together a checklist which you may want to have a look at when you're looking at the letters that you receive to make sure they include all the relevant information. Sometimes not all organisations are up to speed with what checks they should be doing on staff. So this list hopefully will just help with that a little bit. And then if we move on to the third section, so looking at volunteers. So this section will include governors, trustees and parent helpers generally within this section. And you'll see that some of the checks for volunteers are similar to the checks done for employed staff. So the blue section, DBS, and the identity section, which we've already talked about, are there. And the section 128 column on the end is also there for any governors and trustees if they have been appointed since 2016 if you're an academy, or 2018 if you are a maintained school. So the checks are the same as we've looked at for employees, but you'll see there's no prohibition checks in this section. There's no right to work in the UK checks required in this section either. So it's a much slimmer version than the employed staff section. And lastly, just to be clear, trainee and student teachers, again, further information in Keeping Children Safe, but sometimes people are not quite sure whether individuals who are trainee or student teachers should be on their single central record. There's further guidance which says that where they're salaried by the school, then the school is responsible for making sure that the checks have been carried out. Where the trainees are fee funded, then it's the responsibility of the initial teacher training provider to carry out the check. So again, that would come via a letter of assurance. So that is a quick fly through the single central record, just to give you some further information and detail about the various checks. As I've said, lots more information in Keeping Children Safe in Education, lots more detail and links to other websites where you can find further information. But hopefully that just will clarify some of the common questions that certainly I get asked when I'm out and about visiting schools. Thanks for listening.